Jola, do you want to get started?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Welcome, participants from around the world. Welcome to session 9A, a global view on equitable retreat. My name is Jola Ajibade. I'll be moderating the session. We have 4 speakers today. I believe some of them will be speaking about retreat and others will be speaking about migration. So you get a double package. Each speaker has 15 minutes to present their work, and we'll have the Q&A at the end of the session. I'll ask the audience to please write their questions in the question box, not the chat box. Our first speaker is Nicholas Micinski. He is an assistant professor of political science and international affairs at the University of Maine. He will be speaking about measuring climate migration aid. Nicholas, over to you.
Hi, I'm also co-presenting with Sophie Schriever, who's here, and she'll be leading the presentation here. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and how's that?
Looks perfect to me. So I'm Sophie. I'm going to start presenting then. Thank you everyone for being there. Nick and I are presenting today about our try to estimate climate migration aid. So realized actually that weather-related disasters, as we've seen with the IDMC report for 2020, account for 3/4 of total internal displacement, and climate change-induced migration and displacement has received increasing attention during the last decade, also on an institutional level, with an inclusion in the Cancun Agreement. However, we couldn't really find precise numbers on climate migration aid. So could you go back to the research question one, Nick? Sorry. So we were actually wondering how much development aid is targeting climate migration, who are the main donors and implementing partners, where and on what is the aid spent, and what are the main activities of climate migration projects. And then we looked on to what do we actually know about climate migration aid. So we've seen an institutional awareness after the IPCC report in 1990 mentioning displacement in relation to climate change, and with the Cancun Agreement and the inclusion of migration in the adaptation framework. And then we also saw an institutional manifestation with the Nansen Initiative, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, the Warsaw Mechanism, then the mention in the Global Compact for Migration, and now the appointment of an UNHCR Special Advisor on Climate Action. One of the reasons why there's maybe not so much information still, despite this institutional awareness on climate migration, is that actually the definition is more often about environmental migration or disaster displacement, but not really centered on climate change. We still find it striking that the discussion around environmental displacement was triggered by climate change, but now this is not really, we cannot really track this in the data. So the numbers that we found before starting our research was that in the Cancun Agreement, states committed to spending $100 billion by 2020 for climate change mitigation and adaptation, coming from public, private, bilateral, and multilateral sources. And now apparently, or in 2016, about $30 billion were spent on adaptation, and a lot more, $537 billion on mitigation, despite the fact that they are supposed to be equal in importance according to the UNFCCC. And I'll let Nick go on and tell you what we did then.
Sure. So we took 3 approaches to trying to estimate how much money is being spent on climate migration aid. The 3 are here. I'll go through them very briefly right now and then give a little bit more detail. First is just a climate migration aid using OECD data and a keyword search. Second, we use that same data but supplemented it with a keyword search for migration and using Rio markers, which are about climate in general. And then a third approach, which is about using totally different data from IOM, the International Organization for Migration, using a similar keyword search. So in general, I'll just say, so OECD data is the best place to look for development aid. It's sort of the biggest data set we could find. And then we tried to create subsets of that. So we started off with almost 2 million grants from 2002 to 2018, has short project title, description, and other things. And we used an inclusion criteria that they had to have keyword search for both migration and climate. Now, this is algorithmic coding, so it wasn't a human coding, it was just the computer deciding if it had climate and migration in it. You can see here a list of sort of the key words that we used. We're open to actually anyone giving us feedback on this. We want to refine the keyword search to make it better. But out of those 2 million grants, only about 5,700 were included for climate migration specific activities. Next, though, we excluded things that might be related to geophysical hazards. And we'll go a little bit more into this in detail at the end in our discussion, but we wanted to make sure that this is climate specific, not environment or natural disasters. So we excluded things like earthquakes, tsunamis, seismic, tectonic, volcano, or eruption. And that left us with about 5,721. And that's what we run the first data set on. The second estimate looks at the same set of OECD data. The inclusion criteria was based on just a keyword search for migration. And we used a separate set of coding indicators for Rio markers. And these are markers that are coded by the the donor country who is submitting the grants to the OECD to keep track of them. And they get to code if it's related to biodiversity, climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, desertification, or the environment. And so we included them if they had at least one of those as part of it. It had to be both migration in the keyword search and have one of the Rio markers. And that had about the same number of grants, 5,775. We used a similar exclusion criteria, which were the geophysical hazards, and that left us with 5,721. The third set of estimates that we'll go through in a little bit draws on IOM Earmarked Funding. This is a separate set of data, completely different. It's the most inclusive sort of line item budget we could get for migration data. It also means that we assume that all IOM data is related already to migration because the organization does so much work on migration. And we use the same keyword search for climate as we did in the first estimate. So using all of those words. Based on that, we had similar exclusion criteria. It gets down to only 286. Of course, it's much smaller because it's just one organization, not an inclusive data set. And we try to triangulate that to see if we can see some of the estimates. Just to give you some top line findings, we found that $4.9 to $6.2 billion were spent from 2002 to 2018 on climate migration. It increased from about 49 million per year to 279 per year. That's over 460% increase. And that outpaced increases in other total aid, climate aid, and migration management aid. The other thing is, the main channel of climate migration aid was going through recipient governments. So donor countries were giving it to, and the actually implementing partner was a recipient government. And that was followed by UN agencies, with UNHCR being the largest single actor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the end, but IOM claims to be one of the largest actors within it. And I think there's a few other papers talking about international organizations, but I'm really excited to hear how they see this data. But UNHCR in our data set was the largest actor on climate migration. The main purpose is usually material relief. We think of that as food aid and shelter, or infrastructure. And these were large infrastructure projects related to climate migration. The top donor countries were Canada, the UK, US, EU, and Japan, including, and then another data set, we also had Germany and Sweden as part of it. The top recipient countries were Pakistan, the DR Congo, Kenya, Sudan, and Mexico. Whereas in our second data set, they're a little bit different: Turkey, Bangladesh, Mexico, Lebanon. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see the two estimates compared against each other. So the first estimate and the second estimate. One is, remember, CM is just the keyword search, and the CM Rio includes the Rio indicators. You can see that overall, climate migration aid generally increased over time. And that increased more than 460% over the 16 years. However, you can see the two estimates have several years that have serious outliers, and I can explain those in just a bit. If we compare the trends to wider development aid, clearly climate migration aid is only a small percentage of overall aid. It's just 0.27%. And I think we assume that climate migration is going to be a smaller percent, obviously. But the increase in climate migration aid outpaced other increases in total aid, climate aid, and migration management aid. So during the similar period, you can see that total aid increased by 29%, climate aid increased by 13%, and migration management aid increased by 300%. Well, climate migration aid was 460% increase, so quite interesting. In this chart, you can see the sort of gray background is total aid. It's charted against the right axis, whereas the lines are all on the left axis. It shows that climate aid and migration aid generally follow the trend of overall total aid during this time period, whereas climate migration aid, the blue lines on the bottom, they also sort of follow the total aid peaks and troughs. However, the climate migration Rio actually has a few spikes that are quite outliers. Here we go, looking a little more specifically at the first.
Nick, can you speak up a little bit more? We can hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
If you speak again, can you say something again?
Yes, hello.
It's been low for a while. I've been trying to chat with you in the chat box, but I don't think you saw it. Can you move your audio set closer or something so we can hear what you're saying? We can't hear you at all now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Better. Yeah, okay. That's better.
Let's go with that instead.
Thank you.
If I just zoom into this, this is our first climate estimate, a climate migration estimate. It's using just the keyword search. If we break it down using the sort of real markers to know what it's being spent on, you can see that in green, the grants that had no real marker, this represented most of the grants that were included because of the keyword search, but were not included via the Rio estimate. So this is the difference between the first and second estimate. And that large spike in 2009, 2010, 2011, clearly you go, what's going on there? Well, this was in response to aid for people who were displaced by floods in Pakistan during the 2008, 2009, 2010. But those weren't included in any real markers because floods aren't counted by any of the real markers. But we think it should be included in climate migration in general because of it being related to some climate change indicators. Here we can look at the second estimate. This is the one based on real markers. It relies on hand coding of grants. It has a much more even increase over time. However, there are several huge grants that were included in 2018 because the UK government coded them as a real grant. But to our knowledge, we don't actually understand why they would be considered part of climate change or climate migration. Overall, when you look at Rio indicators, most of the grants are in the environment subset, while the climate, the first estimate that we had mostly climate adaptation as its second highest, while this second estimate that we had mostly climate mitigation as its second highest. So I think this is something we need to question. Where is climate migration aid going? Is it going through climate mitigation or climate adaptation? I just want to briefly show the third estimate, which is using IOM earmarked data. IOM earmarked data is obviously more detailed than the OECD data, and it shows a clear difference. IOM thinks they're spending a lot more money than the IOM data suggests, 389 million over this time period. If we look at the OECD data, it's much smaller. It's 40 to 80 million over the same time period. So we have a lot to contrast there. I'll now hand it back to Sophie.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I think you already touched upon some of the points that I'm going to mention, but a bit like some aspects we wanted to highlight still. So we're actually wondering which one of the two ways of coding the OECD data is the best one. So the keyword algorithm one, obviously being a bit more inclusive, but we also realized that sometimes depending on the context, environment or mitigation were included in a meaning of the word that was maybe not necessarily the one that we were aiming for. But on the other hand, the human coding, so the real marker coding, could also have some bias because governments want to portray projects as climate related and want to be perceived as actors on climate migration aid. So we're actually wondering a bit which one is the better method. Nick already mentioned something about the trends. So we see climate migration aid is increasing, which is not very surprising because it's only become a topic in the last decade or 2 decades or so. And it still remains only a small part of development aid, as we already discussed. I still wanted to talk a bit about this mitigation and adaptation statistics that Nick was already mentioning. So in the Rio subset, we saw that 17% of the grants were categorized as climate mitigation and 12% as climate adaptation. And in the subset with the keywords, we had 4% climate adaptation and 3% mitigation. We actually expected the grants to be in climate adaptation more because this was how they categorized with the UNFCCC. So migration goes under adaptation. So we're still a bit wondering why. Well, one of the solutions is
I'm
that
sorry, Sophie, is this your last slide? You have just 1 more minute. We have to wrap up. I sent you a message, but you
yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
Sophie, you wrap up. Go ahead and wrap up with your discussion.
Sorry. So actually, we think it's just because there's so much more spent on mitigation in absolute terms than on adaptation. Nick, I can jump over the 2 next. We have some limitations to discuss, but I think you want to speak about the new Rio marker, so go ahead and wrap up with this.
The last thing is just that we propose that there should be a new Rio marker specific for climate migration, and it should include migration and climate change, but not the geophysical hazards. And this is important to track this funding because currently we only know about disaster displacement or some climate change. And it would be, it's important for countries, industrialized countries, to realize their special role in impacting emissions on climate and migration and displacement. So we'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Sophia. I'm sure we'll have the question time to unpack some of the things you presented. Really great presentation. Our next speaker is Lisa Kelley. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Colorado at Denver. She will be speaking about cumulative socio-natural displacements, reconceptualizing climate displacement in the world already on the move. A brilliant title, I think. Over to you, Kelley. Lisa.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I'll say to begin how excited I am to be here and to learn from people that have been thinking about this issue for a long time. This is a deeply collaborative paper that was written with 2 colleagues, Dr. Kimberly Thomas of Temple University and Dr. Annie Shattuck of Indiana University. And that's currently winding its way through review. And this was a talk that originally we had intended, or Kim had intended to give, given her deep empirical focus on questions of sea level rise in both Bangladesh and Vietnam. Unfortunately, unable to be here for really important reasons, but I would recommend her work in particular if you're here from a perspective of sea level rise questions. And I also, I suppose, apologize for the lesser presentation you will get at my hands. All right. So this paper emerged for the 3 of us out of what were ongoing sort of conversations with one another about our field research in different regions of agrarian Southeast Asia. And these were just offhand conversations, but they were increasingly cohering around a desire to think together and to think through this question of how we conceptualize migration, as Jola put it, and as our title speaks it, in an agrarian world already on the move. And specifically what we were seeing in all three of the sites we work in were intensifying climate violences in northeastern Laos in the form of severe droughts, in the Mekong Delta in the form of sea level rise and salinization, and in southeast Sulawesi in the form of severe floods. And simultaneously, what we were observing were increasing both everyday mobilities and short and long-term mobilities of people to and from agrarian areas. And these trends we were noting are also structuring, we believe, of many other agrarian regions in the global south, not only as evidenced by the increasingly severe climate changes playing out in these regions, but in the context of what has been a 2 to 3 decades transformation in global labor migration regimes. And this is just one indication of these. The growth in remittances, now 3 times the amount of official development assistance globally, and reflecting the influx of remittances from international regions, often back into agrarian economies. So these understandings and these engagements in our field sites were a really important starting point for us. But equally for us, we felt resistant to what appeared to be both overly catastrophist and arguably overly resilientist readings of migration and climate linkages. And I'm borrowing here this language from Agostini and Moretti. And within more catastrophist framings, for instance, migration is often taken to be a failure of adaptation as evidence of displacement. And this is a framing I think we see, for instance, in the wildly variable estimates of probable climate migrants or probable climate refugees, such as those most recently circulated by the World Bank and by reports from the Institute of Economics and Peace. And I think these perspectives, of course, very valuably highlight stakes to people's lives and livelihoods, but also tap into what are longstanding and problematic racialized Malthusian imaginaries about people seeking refuge. And this, for instance, is evidenced by New York Times coverage such as this article, The Great Climate Migration in July of last 2002, first suggesting that climate changes in Mexico will drive a displacement of rural people from the countryside, and next making the logical leap that they'll be pushing at the border of the US. And this, as Andrew Baldwin's work has evidenced, is one way in which these discourses can so quickly play into exclusionary and xenophobic national security agendas. On the other hand, and exemplifying more resilientist framings has been arguably what's an overemphasis on migration as a viable adaptation strategy, as in climate adaptation policies that tend to be more focused on questions of individual preparedness and risk reduction. And these framings also valuable from a certain perspective in highlighting people's everyday agencies and aspirations and how these shape responses to pathways of change. But arguably also short-circuiting the questions of responsibility, justice, and care that emerge when we bring the structures and institutions producing violent change also more fully into view. And so this was, in general, what we felt reflecting a need to think about questions of mobility, migration, and displacement with a fuller range of historical processes and relation in view that have, on the one hand, both rendered agrarian areas so susceptible to severe climate impacts, but have also often instantiated dependence on migration as a necessary coping response. And so this was our question and our starting point in engaging in this work. And as the title suggests, we ultimately came to this notion of cumulative socio-natural displacement, which I'll introduce in just a minute. But I do want to acknowledge the really valuable and orienting conceptual starting points that informed our thinking and much of the great literature on these themes that we were trying to think with. And the first of these is a broader scholarship on environmental migrations, which very much acknowledging Sophie and Nick's point on the slippage here between environment and climate, but at least provides one framework here for thinking about this web of geopolitical, social, economic, environmental relations that are productive of migration, while also insisting that categorizing climate migrants from non-climate migrants is neither empirically possible nor necessarily, what would be the words? Necessarily an appropriate way to frame the issue. And a second here body of work we were really thinking with were theories of displacement from critical human geography. And in particular here thinking with the work of feminist political economist Marion Warner and her recent work on global displacements in the Caribbean. And this was work, I think, for us, which really helpfully theorized displacement as part and parcel of really long-standing processes of uneven development, helping to reveal kind of the blurriness between what could be seen as more voluntary adaptive migrations and more involuntary distress displacements. And the other thing that this literature was really helping us think through were how shock events such as floods and droughts interact with slower and much longer in the making processes of agrarian and ecological change, state policy, social difference, and other kinds of relations and processes to beget migration and displacement. And finally, we were really inspired by work at the intersection of agrarian and mobility studies. And this work, I think, super interestingly, is showing how mobilities, yes, reflect these displacement-inducing processes, but also in many cases serve to counteract violent change and uneven developments, in the process producing not a continuous trajectory towards displacement, but highly contingent and indeterminate processes of change. So these were strands of scholarship that led us to this notion of cumulative socio-natural displacement, which tries to situate migration not as the sole sort of read or indicator of climate displacements, but rather as one of many facets of ongoing and unraveling changes in agrarian regions. We also felt that this notion of cumulative socio-natural displacements could be helpful to understanding why in the first place agrarian regions were so susceptible to climate changes. And so as we thought about these and tried to apply this perspective to the cases and the regions we've been working in, we realized that despite these highly disparate commodity contexts and climate contexts of the three different site national development contexts as well, we could observe several shared processes that were constitutive of these cumulative socio-natural displacements. And among others, and offering these just as a starting point for theorizing these changes, histories of dispossession via state and colonial policies, long-term non-climatic ecological environmental changes, intensifications in export commodity productions, as well as accelerating agribusiness investments. And here, migration and climate also a dimension, though not the sole dimensions or indicators of these changes. And so what I'll do really briefly with the remainder of the talk is just to try and concretize this point, thinking through some of my own work in Eastern Indonesia on the themes of flooding. And here, and I'm showing you here in the red dots, major floods that have taken place. And what you can perhaps notice here is that there were 3 in this 50-year period preceding 2010, and there have been 4 major and severe floods since, including floods in 2020 that most recently left 49 villages underwater and forced thousands of people to evacuate their homes and fields. And these events on the surface certainly appear to represent a scenario of climate displacement, not least given the long-term increases in overall precipitation volumes, climate models predicting this intensification of flooding, and the government's insistence on attributing floods to freak climate events. Our contention, my contention through some of this work is that we need to see both floods and mobilities as both accentuating and as accentuated by climate change, but resulting from much longer term processes of displacement. And so I'll touch on just a couple of those, not having time to get so fully into this case. The first I want to highlight are a series of racialized settlement and economic development schemes that were put in place in this region under military dictatorship through the 1960s and 1970s. And these programs were formative in settling the floodplains and shaping the severity of impacts we see today. Among other things, indigenous Tulaki people in the region were forced out of hillside settlements and down into lowlands along main roads that had been constructed under the Dutch colonial regime. And prohibitions were put in place on existing practices of landscape mobility. Simultaneously, massive colonization schemes undertaken by the state moved hundreds of thousands of presumably or presumed to be more commodity savvy and migrants into these areas. And one of the things we can see from these two visuals is, well, hopefully you can see this, are not only the growth of settlements, and potentially you can see the flooded wet rice lands in the central river valley, but also here showing you forest cover as it would have existed in 1972 and what exists today. So much of these mediating and buffering lowland swamps actually cleared and converted through these schemes as well. If we fast forward into recent decades, what we see is a state policy regime less focused on sedentarizing agrarian peoples and more focused on incentivizing the mobility of agribusiness capital. And this is manifested in over 300 concessions for agribusiness or large-scale land leases for industrialized operations since just 2009. And these schemes, as you can see, I'm showing you here in the red, yellow, and orange for the entire province, have largely been concentrated along these hillsides upstream of the Kanawha River that's implicated in the flooding in this region. And they also fit into what is a strategic government master plan for developing hydropower and a nickel mining corridor in the region. And this has begat not only expropriations of smallholder lands that may have been used to otherwise adapt to flood events, but also upstream forest clearance and silting and landslides that have blocked critical river passage points. So thinking of these changes when they beget and produce flood vulnerability then, as yes, having something to do with higher precipitation volumes, but also having critically to do with a history of engineering and transforming not only waterways, but ways of life, settlement, and access to agrarian resources. And this was something we actually observed across all three cases, that we have these highly different commodity and climate contexts, and yet these processes of shared socio-natural displacement are similarly begetting a dependence on mobility in each, as when these so-called climate events occur. So I will conclude here. I think I'm almost out of time, but I want to suggest that if we think about climate-linked migration as a question of cumulative socio-natural displacements, this doesn't necessarily diminish our read of the significance of migration to people's adaptive responses, or even the significance of adapting and addressing climate changes in agrarian regions. But it can open up and encourage us to broaden our sense of what constitutes good climate policy, arguably taking us away from a predominant emphasis on either individual preparedness or planned relocation schemes, and instead centering the importance of thinking simply here with the Southeast Sulawesi case, questions of land reform, migrant justice, stronger controls on agribusiness investment. And so I'll conclude here, but I also want to say, with recognition to the powerful work that's already been presented and that will be presented, my acknowledgement of climate migration as an important administrative and jurisdictional term. So thanks for all this. I'm looking forward to questions and more discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for that brilliant presentation. Lots of questions I'm sure you'll have during the question time. Thank you again. So next speaker is Susan Ekoh. She's a PhD student at the State University of New York, College of Environmental Science and Forestry. She will be talking about climate change and coastal megacities, adapting through mobility. Over to you, Susan.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ajibade. My name is Susan Ekoh. Like she said, I am a PhD student studying environmental and natural resources policy at the State University of New York in Syracuse. And I will be sharing with you about my dissertation, part of my dissertation, which is basically looking at climate migration within and from Lagos as a case study. So Lagos is an urban coastal megacity, and I believe that Lagos offers interesting insights to how climate migration might manifest in urban settings. And so first of all, this work is hinged upon really looking at migration as a form of adaptation. But if migration is a form of adaptation, like why should we study this? Like why is it important? And so one of the reasons is that, as we all know, or we might know, that there's really right now no legal recognition and protection for a category of climate refugees. And we also know that in many parts of the world, there is going to be increase in frequency and intensity of various environmental events and natural disasters associated with climate change. And so really we need to begin to think about and do more research about what it means for people to migrate as a form of adaptation. Similarly, there's also terror hysteria, which is basically the framing of immigration policy as around the world is framed around it being something that's scary, it being something that is related to terror. But if we're going to be having climate refugees and people who will be displaced, we want to reframe that conversation to see migration as an active form of people adapting to these events. Also, conducting these types of studies really help us to be able to develop climate adaptation policies that are biophysically relevant, socially and culturally relevant. This means that there's going to be a variety of policies and tools that will be implemented in different regions, which will be context specific. So when we think about things like managed retreat programs or relocation programs, we want to be able to situate it to the specific context of the regions that we're working in or looking at. And so, like I said before, my research is focused on Lagos. Lagos is an urban coastal megacity. It's also, in terms of population size, really a high population located in a very compact environment. And so we get to see lots of urban pressures, urban development challenges that intersect with this climate change impacts that will be affecting the city in the future. With impacts already being experienced right now, because over the past few years, there have been increases in the frequency and intensity of flooding events. So this research specifically looks at flooding as an environmental issue of concern. And so in terms of the economy of Lagos, in Lagos, like everybody in Nigeria wants to move to Lagos because of the economic opportunities. It's the economic and commercial capital of the country. And so from a rural urban context is the place that everybody ideally wants to be because that's where things are happening. And then what happens when such a city becomes inhabitable or becomes really pressured by climate change impacts? Where do those people go? And so that's why this study is important. From a regional perspective as well, Lagos is also a place that attracts people from other neighboring countries as well in the region. So really understanding how climate migration might play a role in this context will be important. And so the research questions that I was looking at with this specific paper is considering what the long-term and short-term response strategies to flooding are among coastal residents in Lagos. And then within that, trying to find out if migration is a key response or adaptation strategy. Because it's one thing to just assume that everybody wants to move, it's another thing to actually conduct studies and research to know what if migration is an option for people and what that migration will look like. And so another question is to find out why do people choose this strategy and how do they choose that strategy? And beyond that, trying to understand what types of people are able to choose migration as a form of adaptation to increase flooding events. And so I framed this study with the multi-causality framework by Black et al., which basically posits that migration is a combination of different factors. Climate change migration will not be the only driver. It's going to intersect with other factors, other drivers at the macro scale, at the micro scale, and at the meso scale. So considering other factors such as political factors, social, economic, and even personal and household characteristics that determine if people will move or if they will stay. And also other concepts that I feel are really important to this conversation is basically trying to situate migration as an adaptive strategy. So we need to find ways to make it adaptive and not maladaptive. And that's by conducting such research to find out what it looks like for people on the ground. And also recognizing that migrants are adaptive agents, which is basically giving them agency on this process of migration. And so I conducted this study last year, collected data through mixed methods approaches by conducting online surveys for people who live in Lagos, in the island areas and in the mainland areas of Lagos, and got about 352 respondents. I also conducted interviews due to COVID. The interviews were conducted by phone, and I had 21 participants in these interviews to ask them questions about what migration looks like for them. And in the analysis, these numbers, especially the online surveys, change depending on what analysis that I use. And so to answer the first research question, which basically looks at what the flood response strategies, short-term and long-term, will be. So I asked questions about how people have responded in the form of movement or other factors in the past. And as you can see here from this result, it shows that over 50% of people have, from this study, the people involved in this study, have moved temporarily due to flooding events in the past 10 years, while we have about 12% who have moved permanently. The other factors that were noted were people who said they just stayed and managed the flooding events. Other people adopted some structural changes in their environments, such as building drainages or building small bridges that will let them move from point A to point B. Other people mentioned that they extracted water from their homes, and others just walked through water to be able to get to their destinations, either work or school or any other activities they had to do. And so I also asked questions about what preferred adaptation strategies would be going into the future. And here we can see from the results that relocation by 35% of the people is a major form of adaptation strategy. Also, we see again, drainage fixes, waste management. Others have mentioned just planning ahead of time to be able to avoid being impacted by flooding. So we can see that relocation also comes up as a major chosen form of adapting to increased flooding. And then secondly, I asked questions about what future migration will look like if people will be interested to move, if flooding events become more intense and more frequent in the future. And interestingly, as the result shows here, 71% of the people surveyed will be moving, stated that they will be moving if flooding events become more intense and frequent. Just about 6% say they will stay behind. And so this question, this part of it looks at who is likely to move. So we have intent to move, which is one part of it. On the other hand, we want to look at also the ability to move. But this question addresses who is likely to move. And to look at the different demographics of people and how that influences migration likelihood, I ran one-way ANOVA tests and t-tests of means for different socio-demographic variables of like age, gender, education, area of residence, whether they lived on the island, which is typically more vulnerable because it's closer to the coast, and then the mainland area. But after conducting those tests, age was the only one that was significant in terms of finding out the people who are likely to move statistically. And so from the graph, we can see here that younger people are more likely to move because the number 3 there represents likelihood of movement, 1 means that people choose to stay, they won't be moving. And 2 here represents people who say they might. So it's people who are unsure about moving. And we can see a downward trend that as the age increases, the likelihood of movement reduces. So this is important because it helps us to think about what the age demographics are like and how we can facilitate movement for different groups of people, considering things like their age. And the peak of it is actually people within the age of 35 to 44. And so, like I mentioned before, while there is intent to move, there's also the ability to move. I conducted interviews, like I mentioned before, and so these are some of the interview responses that really talk about what it means in terms of being able to move. And here we can see from this participant sharing that high-income earners have various options in terms of moving, especially immediately after a flooding event. So for example, someone who has a higher income can easily move out temporarily to a hotel and stay till the floodwaters die down. Those same opportunities are not really available to people of low income. They don't have the capacity, the income to be able to handle such responses. And so we can see that even though people have intent to move, their income status determines if they're able to actually make movement actualized. So here also, this is the second respondent who is talking about how high-income earners in Lagos have more options to relocate to better neighborhoods so that they can cope with flooding events. I also was trying to find out what the destination choice would be, because there's this general idea that most people will be moving across borders. And so I introduced this question in the surveys and the interviews to find out what people's choice of destination will be. And here, interestingly, the results show that 76% of the people will relocate within Lagos, while 9% will relocate to another country. Also, relocation within Nigeria itself is also low. And I had a lot of people, or some people, tell me during the interviews that moving to a different city in Nigeria didn't really make too much sense because of lack of economic opportunities, as most of the economic opportunities are concentrated in cities such as Lagos or Abuja. And so that's something to take into account. And something that I would need to explore further would be what categories of people choose this certain destination. So what kind of people would choose to relocate to other countries versus relocating within Lagos? And is this a factor of income? Because it's something that I suspect, since over half of the surveyed population within my study make less than $131 monthly. And so if their income levels are low, I believe that may have an impact on how far they can think of moving or where they will move to. As I will show you in a couple of slides about the needs that were communicated by my research participants about what the needs are in terms of movement, which basically kind of supports the idea that income might be a factor. Okay, my time is going. So I'll just wrap up. I have another slide here which talks about migration drivers. Like I mentioned before, there's the multi-causality factor. Here it shows that apart from flooding, we also have other factors that are drivers. This study was conducted during the COVID period, and it shows that diseases were a concern at that time. But it just basically buttresses the fact that although flooding is an important driver, there are also other drivers that would facilitate movement or that would drive people to move. And also, in terms of relocation needs and constraints, finances were a huge deal. Housing is another one that I would like to highlight. Economic opportunities. People are also interested in moving to less vulnerable areas. They're also thinking about immigration policies at points of destinations that will be a constraint to movement, as well as things like social factors as well. Proximity to work was another thing. We also have, in terms of people that decided that they won't be moving, and that's based on them maintaining their already existing livelihoods, limited financial resources, and to be able to maintain identities. And I'll just wrap up by saying that from this study, the study basically shows that younger people are more likely to move. So for policymakers, it's important to figure out what that will look like in terms of facilitating migration for such groups of people. Housing provision is a key need, as mentioned. So what types of housing support can be provided? One thing that I forgot to mention is that I asked questions about how much people trust government in terms of thinking about planned relocation strategies. And generally, the trust in government is pretty low. And so maybe it should be considered that community-based strategies might be prioritized in this situation. And finally, what are the options for relocation within the city, since this is a chosen option by people within Lagos based on this study?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Please leave your questions in the Q&A box. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was another brilliant presentation. I'm sure there will be lots of questions at the end of this session. So we have to move quickly to the next presenter, and that's Gabriela Alverio. She's a JD and PhD student in the University program in Environmental and Policy with a concentration in political science at Duke University. She will be talking about the role of international organizations in equitable planned relocation. So really building on some of the things that I think Susan was alluding to. How do we ensure planned relocation if people choose that as an option for adaptation? Over to you, Gabrielle.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And yes, that was a perfect segue, Susan. So really excited to get into this. Before I start, I'd just like to also give a really big shout out to my co-authors, Sarah Hoagland, Aaron Coughlin-DePrez, and Catherine Mock on this paper that was recently published in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences. So any feedback that you have on the framework for equity that I'm going to cover and its applications is much appreciated. Here we go. So a brief outline. First, I'm going to go into the motivation by talking about the link between climate change and migration and the history of inequity in planned relocation, and then go into the framework of priorities for equitable planned relocation that we establish in this paper, and briefly turn to international organizations by discussing a few points of intervention by IOs in the space, and then with future directions. So normally here I go into a bit of a long spiel about the links between climate change and migration because it's not always clear to everyone, but I know that it comes as no surprise to this group that as people no longer have sufficient access to critical resources, their mobility is impacted. And so I'll skip most of that spiel to simply reiterate the point that so many have been making throughout this conference, which is that we have an opportunity for proactive planning that ensures justice and dignity. And that really highlights to me the important role of proactive policymaking. So to that end, the UNFCCC has recognized planned relocation as a fundamental adaptation to climate change for over 10 years now. As a brief refresher, planned relocation, of which managed retreat is a subset, is when people either on their own volition or with the help of organizations or governments move to a new location. And planned relocation has been carried out many times across history outside of the context of climate change, as well as currently within that context. But when we look historically at these examples, one of the main issues that comes up is problems with inequity. In the paper, we have a table of 15 case examples highlighting different kinds of inequities that have occurred as a result of planned relocation, mostly due to environmental impacts. But here I'll just touch on a few. And the first that I think is maybe the most important is to acknowledge the historic forced relocation of Indigenous peoples in the US. specifically both because this history has led to long legacies of trauma and injustice, which must be taken into account when planning future relocations in order to ensure they don't reproduce the past. And then to point out that Indigenous peoples have a disproportionate risk to the negative impacts of climate change. So it's even more important to center them in the conversation around solutions. Moving from a more broad look at inequitable planned relocation, I also want to highlight two specific examples in more recent history. And the first took place in Laos starting in 1997, when the government coerced people to move from areas of upland agriculture where they made their livelihoods to areas supported by lowland paddy rice cultivation. The inequity here comes into play because the promises made by the government to encourage people to move weren't kept in the end. And in the new area, the people were no longer able to grow enough food to survive, and they were now in a place where there were very few alternatives for the sustainability of their livelihoods. Another example of inequity took place in the Carteret Islands of Papua New Guinea, when the government assisted in the relocation of 2,700 people as a result of coastal erosion and sea level rise. And in the new site that they moved to, there were also challenges to livelihoods, but a new challenge was disputes over fishing access between the newcomers and those who had already been there. So inequities in terms of planning for receiving communities as well as communities who are migrating. So again, these are just a few examples really meant to highlight some of the many issues of inequity that can arise in planned relocation and how they can pop up in ways that we may not initially think of. And finally, to hopefully highlight the challenges in implementing a policy like planned relocation. As a response to some of these inequitable outcomes, there has been some literature on planned relocation and equity that this paper builds on. Due to time constraints, I won't go into every single paper and what they've contributed to the field, but what I hope this framework points out to you is that there have been a lot of papers on perspectives on planned relocation, which include aspects of equity on specific problems or from specific lenses like human rights. And there's also been a lot written on applying equity considerations to climate adaptations broadly. So what we did was put these literatures in conversation with one another and create a framework of equity as it pertains to planned relocation that builds on what we know about planned relocation and what we know about equity as it relates to climate adaptation. So without further ado, the framework that we came up with can be honed into 3 priorities. And of course, there are many, many priorities and different aspects that went into narrowing it down to these 3. But what we really tried to do in synthesizing it was come up with what we saw as the many aspects of equity in the literature and the process of enacting planned relocation from start to finish, and bring focus to the temporal scale in which equity is often left out. So the first piece is recognition of affected stakeholders. And recognition is simply the inclusion of often marginalized groups in the decision-making process. Oftentimes, recognition is played out on a surface level, either by consulting someone at the end of the process or allowing them to inform some decisions as chosen by the people in power. But what we mean by recognition is involvement and power given to affected stakeholders throughout the process. And a really, really important note here is that communities are not a monolith. Sometimes the opinions that are voiced may be difficult to incorporate, and in others may be completely irreconcilable in a single solution. Rather than reducing participation to fewer voices, which is often the case, we propose that space for a variety of opinions should be given, and rather than developing a one-option plan for relocation, creating a multiple option plan that allows for people to choose what option is best for them in the relocation. Now, the second factor here is socio-cultural risk factors. And these risk factors are social vulnerabilities rooted in culturally defined power structures. What that really means is being elderly, being a person of color, having livelihoods that are invested in the at-risk location, depending on the situation that we're talking about. And what this means in practice isn't that every individual receives an equal share of the outcomes, but that those who are affected disproportionately by the environmental risk due to these sociocultural risk factors receive an outcome that actively takes them into account. I will note here, though, that this is not to suggest that planned relocation efforts must right all historical and structural wrongs. But what it does suggest is that without actively taking these conditions into account in the planning and implementation process, they will likely be reinforced. Now, the last feature in the framework that we have here is evaluation on multiple measures of well-being. And really, this comes out of opposition to the norm, in which the norm is that evaluations are done in terms of the economic and environmental outcomes rather than the human well-being outcomes. These can range from access to clean water, to sustainable livelihoods, to having access to political structures, and everything in between. What this means, though, is that the implementers must identify, incorporate, and later evaluate success on the measures of well-being that are critical to the health and survival of communities as defined by them, hence the arrow that goes around and makes this a cycle. So there's a lot more that we could talk about in terms of the framework, but I want to briefly turn to the second part of the paper, which is about how international organizations are both well-positioned and have unique features that allow them to implement this framework. Of course, we think this framework is applicable to policymakers at all levels of government, as well as non-governmental actors, but IOs specifically are uniquely positioned based on their ongoing work on climate adaptation, their focus on equity, and their stated commitment to preventing involuntary resettlement. So now I'll turn to the three of the unique points of intervention by IOs that we call out in the paper. The first, that I'm sure will come as no surprise to you, is that IOs play a key role in setting the international agenda. And what that does is guide the attention of governments, NGOs, and other IOs towards coordinated action. Importantly, the reach of IOs and agenda setting in relation to planned relocation goes from implementing planned relocation on the ground to redefining sovereignty for nations who have lost their territory, to abiding by principles of justice through the centering of Indigenous peoples. Along with agenda setting, some international organizations can push forward the agenda they set through the provision of funding, and they can also provide funding for projects contingent upon the implementation of policies that promote equity. These kinds of actions better support countries in addressing the flows of internal migration that we all know are predicted to far exceed external migration. The second point of intervention is best practices and accountability. And what we mean by that is each time a government or other local actor implements a project, there are lessons to be learned that would benefit other actors the next time around. Given where they sit in the global structure, IOs are in a really great position to gather these best practices and share them with networks of practitioners, governments, and other interested stakeholders. Importantly, we added establishing accountability here because having best practices does not ensure their implementation. What we saw in creating our repository of instances of inequitable planned relocation is that many climate and environmental related planned relocations have been carried out by well-meaning actors who face the challenges of balancing organizational priorities, community needs, funding constraints, and a lack of a historical standard for transparency and accountability. So as a necessary counterpart to disseminating best practices, IOs are also really well positioned to promote transparency and create accountability in order to establish the baseline that we need for equitable action. Lastly, one of the most powerful features of international organizations is their ability to facilitate coordination amongst a wide variety of actors. This feature is especially relevant for international migrants who, as was mentioned before, face a whole host of issues related to their migration, including endangered livelihoods, diminished political efficacy, and reduced access to critical resources. Migrants also risk being labeled a national security concern by anti-immigrant regimes, which can lead to an exacerbation of those negative impacts. And IOs are really well positioned to coordinate relocations within and across borders that specifically mitigate these impacts and take them into account. So again, a lot more to touch on there, but I'll just turn to some future directions for this paper. The next step is creating a guide for policymakers that is almost done, and we're hoping to disseminate through our networks, and also specifically to the UNFCCC Task Force on Displacement, who is in the process of creating frameworks for actors to implement and managing climate migration. Also, I mentioned that repository of planned relocation efforts in the past, and we plan on continuing this review and systematizing it so that we can all continue to learn from history as we move forward and planned relocation becomes an option that is more and more viable. So with that, I will just say thank you to all of you and to all of my co-presenters, and especially to our chair, Professor Ajibade. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Gabriela. This session is just amazing. Lots of great insight and ideas and questions that are just popping in. And I'm going to encourage everyone, you perhaps can show your videos and get ready to answer a couple of questions. I have one question first. I'm going to lead with just a question, and this is for Sophie and Nick. And Sophie and Nick, thank you again for your presentation. Really brilliant work that you guys have done. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were presenting was the issue around who were the benefactors of the aid. You talked about the different institutions that were involved. You talked about the growth of the aid over time, but I didn't quite get the information about who is really, I mean, you also mentioned the issue of some of the aid going to the countries, like specific countries, but you didn't go into detail about which groups are benefactors when they go through the UNSC and UNHCR. And also, which specific countries did you find, if you at all found this in your work, were getting some of those money? Is it countries that had challenges with both climate migration and conflict issues, or is it just countries that had challenges with just climate migration? If you can speak to that a little bit, that'll be helpful.
Great, shall we answer now?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll start with a few things. The issue around who benefits from aid, there's no data in, at least the way OECD tracks it, about who the end beneficiary is. It's not tracked that way. We know who the implementing partners are, or it's actually called the channel of delivery. And by that, the governments are the main channels of delivery. It doesn't mean that there aren't individual migrants at the end that are receiving the aid, but the main implementing partner who's doing work on the ground is the government, followed by the UN, and UNHCR is then the biggest one on the block there. In terms of like which groups and what they're like, what kind of work they're doing, I mentioned that the main thing is material relief. That's food aid, shelter, and often these are internally displaced camps that are either run by UNHCR or by the government, and they're providing like the temporary assistance that people need right after they're displaced by climate. So if we take the example of floods in Pakistan, UNHCR had a big response there, just providing aid, food aid, shelter for 3 to 4 months, sometimes up to a year, and then helping people move back. In terms of which countries, let me see, I'll pull it up again. There was a bit of a difference between the two different estimates. The first estimate, the one using keyword search, came up with Pakistan, DR Congo, Kenya, Sudan, and Mexico as the top recipients. Now, that's very different than the next one, which was using the Rio sets, which had Turkey, Bangladesh, Mexico, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. We don't know why it was such a big difference yet. We're going to explore that further in future research. We'd love if others have ideas about why it might be that. The main reason why these two data sets are different, though, is that governments are coding the data to be Rio indicators, meaning that they're related to climate change. So oftentimes the donor government wants to say they're doing more on climate change, and so they have an incentive to say that. And so that might be one of the biases of the recipients as well. So you see Turkey, Bangladesh, and Mexico being very big there. Well, those are countries that have particular interest in the EU and the US. So they may be particularly coding more heavily than others. But these are great questions. Thank you so much for it. And I'm really excited about the rest of the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nick. So there are two questions here. I'm suspecting these questions must be for Lisa. How would we predict cross-influence of emerging clean transportation that is mitigating adverse effects of climate change? That's one. And do you want me to, I'm thinking I should just read both of them so that you can possibly answer them, because we have a couple more questions stacked up. I'm hoping we'll get to some. And if anyone else has responses to these questions, please feel free to answer them. There's another question, this from Bill Da Costa. He asks, we live on a small island here in Hawaii with limited land areas to migrate to upper lands from coastal flooding with sea level rise. With the continental US migrating to Hawaii, that's interesting, which drive our housing prices up? What options do the locals have? Yeah, Lisa, I think this really speaks to some of the things that you presented in your work.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I feel a little at a loss for question one, though I understand its importance and also the importance of transportation infrastructure more generally to these conversations we're having. So if okay and comfortable, I would love to open that up to other speakers with more traction there. But as for the second challenge, question here from Hawaii, I think it's a really powerful and an interesting question. And I think what it's pointing to also is the role of speculative coastal real estate development and gentrification on top of a layered history of colonization, occupation, and imperialism, which has really produced vulnerability to sea level rise in the first place, but also highly constrained adaptation options. And so I think, similar to my conclusion here, which is maybe tackling climate in a technical sense, or even thinking about planned relocation schemes, would be secondary, in my view, to slowing the rates of coastal development and sustained shoreline armoring and erosion that are already taking place by virtue of these speculative coastal developments. So that, to me, in terms of an adaptation strategy, would be a first step, but also acknowledging that in some instances there's not going to be an adaptation in place that's possible over long-term timeframes, and that's certainly the case more so in insular regions like Hawaii than in Southeast Sulawesi, where I'm speaking of this inland region. But I thought that was a great question. Thanks for it.
Yeah, there's another question. I think this for you. I'm going to read a couple for others as well. I think we have about 15 minutes-ish for questions, so we're good on time. And so this is from Alex Deshibini. He said, okay, I'll read the question because he was saying he's been trying to write a long question, but he couldn't write a long question, so he tried to abbreviate. So his question is, do you think combining future climate impact might also inform your political economy approach?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that question, and I'm maybe grasping it wrong because it's an abbreviated version unnecessarily, but you can reach out to me. I'll paste my email in the chat if we want to have a longer discussion on the longer question. But my thinking here is that we do see a kind of polarization in the literature where there's an overly political economic framing that isn't engaging climate strongly enough. And there's a climate framing that isn't engaging political economy strongly enough. And so I think my own work is evident of a bias in the former direction at present, and it could really be strengthened by consideration of a more diverse suite of climate changes. Also apparent in this region are more intensified droughts and intersecting effects of temperature changes, but also by further engagement with climate science and modeling out these events to understand how the very fact and issue of flooding is changing in physical geographical terms and mediating altered experiences of it. So my short answer is yes, absolutely. Would totally benefit from that. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. So Susan, this is for you. I'm going to read two questions all at once so you can answer them. Then I'll go to Gabriela afterwards. So this is from Kelley Loves. The question is, the case of Lagos and the problems faced by the city seems very similar to issues faced in Mumbai. Perhaps there should be a collaboration by these space limit coastal cities. I think this is a comment. But I'll read a question. I think this is from Alex Deshibini. He says, you mentioned relocation within the city. What are the realistic options with, say, 1 to 2 meters sea level rise within Lagos? Has anyone mapped the elevation across the entire city? I think if you can speak to that question, and then I'll go to Gabriela.
Okay, to the comment, first of all, I agree. There are a lot of parallels with other developing countries, such as in Mumbai. And I believe that maybe a first step would be cross collaborations in terms of research, because in Lagos especially, I do not think that at the governmental level that this is something that they're considering. Climate migration, I do not think that that's what they're already considering that. So maybe trying to facilitate those conversations one way or another would be important to move it forward. And to the second question about like what's realistic since people are choosing to move within Lagos, I think realistically, Lagos is a very congested city. The population is really high for the landscape that is already present there. And so some suggestions that I can think of, I feel like one step would be to try to build resilience within the city. So think about urban infrastructure, think about the failures that already exist with current waste management practices, with drainages, being able to establish that. And that's why I feel like climate adaptation should definitely be coupled with development plans and programs, just to be able to build resilience within the city for since many people are there and would choose to relocate there. Another option would be considering satellite cities, satellite towns, but that's also associated with infrastructural development. So thinking about mobility was something that kept coming up in the conversation, especially in my interviews, where people, like, that's a priority for them. They want to be able to get to work easily. And so thinking about road networks, thinking about other forms of transportation, such as rail lines that could connect Lagos with other nearby cities so that everybody doesn't have to live in Lagos. And then creating economic opportunities for people, since jobs are also really important. So basically, I feel like development cannot be put in the back burner. It's something that needs to be prioritized as we think about climate migration or adaptation in general.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment and the slew of ideas that we can think about as we address this issue of climate relocation. So Gabriela, this question is for you. What IOs, I think international organization, are most involved in planned relocations? Are there certain countries or regions that this IOs operates in the most?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the kind of looking to the past that we did and collecting all the case examples, what we saw was actually mostly the World Bank was the one funding the most relocations. In terms of what's happening now, that is future work to come in the systematic review. So I'm not entirely sure, but of what happened in the past, the regions were Southeast Asia was the highest, and then also looking into the Pacific Islands, and the least was done in Latin America. So that was an important finding. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriela. So I'm going to ask this question, and I'm opening it up to anyone who wants to answer it, because it touches on, quite frankly, everything you all have mentioned. So the question is, in planning for managed relocation due to climate change, can anything be learned from the experiences of people forced to relocate for other adverse conditions such as war, civil or ethnic conflict, or economic downturns? So this is a question that touches on everything you all have talked about. So anyone who is willing to answer this, or you can take turns in addressing this question.
I would just say that I think that they're not so separate. I think often, what we have seen in the past, then war, civil or ethnic conflict, economic downturns also correlates with the climate change impacts that we're seeing, and it becomes this cycle. So the short answer is yes. I think that we have a lot to learn, and that we're going to also learn about the intersections of climate change and the things that you mentioned moving forward.
Thank you. Any other comments on that question? I have other questions, but I'm hoping people may want to say something about that before we move to another question.
I will. I think
Sure,
Sophie and I's project speaks directly to this, that many of the actors that are responding to forcibly displaced people who are coming from conflicts are UNHCR, IOM, the World Food Program. Like, these organizations are also providing direct aid to climate migrants who are displaced in similar scenarios. And I will agree with Gabriela that these are intersecting populations. They correlate with each other, but also the actors have the tools and the funding to respond in these very emergency situations. And while many climate change migrants are temporarily displaced, the aid is coming from the same types of organizations that are more long-term displacement.
Thank you, Nicholas. And this question here is from Susan Moser. She says, from what else you've heard at this conference about migration and relocation in developed countries, do you feel there are any fundamental differences between your cases and the situations in the countries like the US or other developed nations? So if you compare some of the things that you've heard in this conference and some of the things that you've also presented, do you think that there are differences in how things have been managed compared to what you know of the US here? Or other developed nations? So this question is really very open-ended, and it can go in any direction that you guys want it to go. Sophie, do you want to take this one as well? Or anyone, quite frankly.
I can jump in.
Yeah.
I think one major difference that I can see from some of the things that have been communicated in this conference have to do with insurance policies, and how that is prevalent in the conversation here in the United States about how communities deal with things like flooding events. But from my own study, just asking people questions about insurance policies, that's something that's almost non-existent. Many people do not have insurance policies for their homes. Majority of the people are renters. And even when homeowners don't have insurance, similarly, we would expect that there was to be the case for people who are renting. So that's something that I don't know if insurance policies need to be brought into the conversation, and how that will impact who is likely to have insurance, who is likely not to be able to afford to have insurance, and how that helps people better cope with things like flooding.
Good, great comments. Any other comments on this topic?
And maybe, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sure.
No, you go.
And maybe interpret it a bit in a very open way, but what we noticed obviously was that the donor countries were mainly global northern countries in our data set. And Nick and I were actually talking about why we want to focus on climate migration and not on environmental migration, and not to follow the example or the definition that most organizations are using, because we do think there's this justice aspect, because you can actually count on what did industrialized nations contribute to climate change, and so what responsibility may be there. And so I do think there's a difference when you think about managed strategic climate mobility in the context of the global north or in the context of the global south. That's maybe a bit related to the question.
Thank you. Oh, it is, absolutely. So I'm just looking at our time. We have 5 more minutes. So I was wondering if each of you would be willing to just give some final thoughts around the questions that we've heard, or even respond to other presenters' presentation. If you have some final comments you would like to say, I think we do have 5 minutes to share some thoughts. So I will probably start with Nick. Yes.
Sure. I'm just making connections with everyone's papers, and I think it's really a beautiful panel because of this. I remember in Gabriela's presentation, and just coming off of Sophie's, this idea of justice and equity and how we think about it within climate migration. And I think one of the surprising findings for us was that recipient governments were one of the main implementing actors. And these are all in developing countries, global south, right? In the global north, of course, the government, FEMA, is the place that should be responding to climate migration, right? And I think we thought that IOs would probably be the top responders in the south. but that wasn't what came out in our findings. So there is a role in the Global South in which the recipient governments are doing a lot of work, maybe using international funding, but are doing a lot of work on the ground. And there's a lot to learn about what's happening there. And maybe the Global North can be learning from the Global South in this way as well.
Great comment. Thank you, Nicholas. I'll go to Lisa.
Sure, and that actually kind of connects to one of these things I was thinking through in relation to the last question we heard on differences between potentially the Global North and the Global South, and thinking about these shifts. And one of them I would say is that the Global South is now the primary recipient of international migrant workers. And from this perspective is doing the most in terms of providing work and alternative economic livelihoods from countries where people are being displaced. And this has been a shift over the past 3 decades, but it's no longer this imagined sort of trajectory to the Global North. And so I think that's one thing I've been thinking about, and it is also kind of related to this question of in planning for managed relocation, what can we learn from experiences? And certainly some of the conversations and experiences shared by Gabriela, but I think which are resonant of this idea that these relocation schemes were poorly managed, and even thinking about relocation schemes that moved people into the swamp and floodplains in Sulawesi at an earlier point in time, these as being productive of their own vulnerabilities and reproducing potentially larger challenges moving forward. So also trying to take that critical sort of socio-environmental lens and thinking about these relocation schemes. But thanks all for the wonderful presentations. I really too am just making the connections and taking the notes, but this was really wonderful to be in conversation with y'all.
Thank you, Gabrielle. If you could say a few words, and then I'll go to, Susan, actually. Susan and then Gabrielle. We have 2 more minutes, and then we'll be saying, we'll be wrapping up. Susan, yeah, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say, I really appreciated being on this panel and hearing from everyone speak about their work. The one thing I can also contribute to right now is thinking about like the justice dimensions of really figuring out who the vulnerable groups are and how they can be assisted to make migration adaptive and not maladaptive. So thinking about what kind of funding mechanisms, what kind of strategies can be applied so that migration is handled in a way that is dignified and keeps people safe.
Yeah, that's such a positive note. Thank you. Gabriela?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of Nick to mention in my answer to the question about where funding came from, it was mostly the World Bank and IOs, but also we found the same thing, which is that it was governments who were mostly implementing or people on their own. And I think that's another aspect is the people who are doing this on their own, planning a relocation, whether it's in small groups or a large community, and that's another thing that we should be looking at. And then the last point was just about the differences between when we were talking about the Global North or Global South is also the discourse and the national security. Lisa, you brought this up, but just the national security concerns that are used to just create fear. And so I think that's just a point I wanted to make about the differences too. But thank you again so much to all of you. It's been great.
Sophie, do you want to say something? Because I started with you and then went to Nick, but I don't know if you want to add any final thoughts.
I think Nick did a beautiful wrap up of our project. Thank you so much, everyone. So interesting.
Thank you all for this amazing presentations, and really thank you for folks who are here. We've raised a lot of very fundamental but also important questions, and it's been a great opportunity to hear this and to just learn so much from this session. I'm hoping you enjoy your next session, and I would say bye to everybody. Please take advantage of all of the other sessions and keep learning. Bye.
And thanks, Jola, for moderating. Bye.
Thank you. That was
Thanks so much. It was great.
Everyone. That was really great. Thank you.
Girl.
Yeah. Bye.